The news of Charles Ashford's death spread through Little Brackstone with the efficiency of a modern telegraph system, though considerably less accurate in its details. By mid-morning on Christmas Day, every household in the village had heard some version of the story, and by afternoon, the versions had multiplied to such an extent that one might have believed half a dozen different men had died under half a dozen different circumstances in the manor. Miss Marple heard the news from Mrs. Cole, who kept the village shop and possessed an uncanny ability to be present at precisely the moment when information was being exchanged. She arrived at Miss Marple's cottage at 10:15, ostensibly to deliver a package that had arrived too late for the previous day's post, but in reality to share the remarkable intelligence that Charles Ashford had shot himself in his study during the Christmas Eve gathering itself, or possibly sometime during the night, depending on which source one credited. "Shot himself," Mrs. Cole said, settling into the chair Miss Marple had offered with the air of someone prepared for a lengthy conversation. "Right there in the study, with a revolver. Found this morning by one of the servants when she went to draw the curtains. Can you imagine? On Christmas morning of all days." "How dreadful," Miss Marple said, which was neither an agreement nor a disagreement, but rather a neutral acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation. She had already deduced that Mrs. Cole did not know the exact timing of death, which meant the police had not yet released precise information. "Was Mrs. Ashford very distressed?" "Mad with grief, I shouldn't wonder," Mrs. Cole said, accepting the tea Miss Marple had begun preparing. "Though between you and me, Miss Marple, I can't say I'm entirely surprised. The man was under some sort of strain, you could see it plain as day. Always snapping at people, always looking worried. There was that business with his son turning up unexpectedly last night, which surely didn't help matters." "His son?" Miss Marple asked, as though the information was new to her. "Richard, his name is? Hasn't been home in a decade or more, and then he arrives without warning on Christmas Eve, looking like thunder himself. I heard from the Hendersons, they were at the party, you know, that there was quite a scene. The two of them arguing in the drawing room, voices raised and everything. Nothing ruins a Christmas gathering quite like family discord." Miss Marple poured the tea with careful attention to the task. "I wonder what brought him home after such a long absence." "Nobody knows," Mrs. Cole said with satisfaction. "That's the question everyone's asking, isn't it? He's been away in America or Australia or somewhere remote. Nobody quite remembers which. But he's back now, though I dare say he'll wish he'd stayed away, what with his father being dead and all. Guilt, perhaps. That's what I think. Perhaps he felt guilty about being estranged and came home to make amends, and the shock of whatever grievances had built up between them was too much for poor Charles." This was an interesting theory, Miss Marple reflected, though it was almost certainly incorrect. In her experience, guilt about estrangement rarely drove people to suicide, though it occasionally drove them to murder. She filed the observation away for later consideration. By evening, further details had emerged, disseminated through the village by Dr. Thornbury, who had been called to the manor to pronounce death official. According to his account, Charles had been shot sometime in the early hours of Christmas morning, between the hours of midnight and 4 o'clock, though the exact time could not be determined without a post-mortem examination. The revolver found beside him was registered to Charles himself and kept in his desk drawer, a fact that suggested suicide more readily than murder, though Miss Marple noted that a suicide who was sufficiently determined to kill himself might just as easily have been murdered by someone familiar with his household and his habits. The police had arrived by mid-morning, led by Inspector Morton, a competent, if somewhat unimaginative man who had been the senior constable in Little Brackstone for the past 8 years. He was a creature of routine and procedure, the sort of officer who preferred cases that resolved themselves according to established patterns. A wealthy man shooting himself in his study, leaving behind a grieving widow and a recently estranged son, fit precisely into the patterns he understood. By the following evening, Miss Marple had received a discreet visit from Inspector Morton himself, who came to her cottage with the air of someone performing a routine duty. He took the chair she offered and accepted a cup of tea with the politeness of a man who knew better than to refuse hospitality from a village elder. "I understand you were at the gathering on Christmas Eve," he began, consulting a small notebook. "I was," Miss Marple confirmed. "It was a lovely evening, I thought, though it did become rather tense when Mr. Ashford's son arrived unexpectedly." "Ah, yes, Richard," Morton said. "You observed tension then?" "A family matter, I would have said," Miss Marple replied carefully. "Nothing more than the usual friction that arises when estranged family members encounter one another after a considerable absence. Did you observe any conflict between Mr. Charles Ashford and his wife?" Here Miss Marple paused, considering carefully how much truth to offer. "They seemed somewhat distant," she said finally. "Though I would not characterize it as overt conflict. One notices these things at social gatherings, you understand. People position themselves at particular distances from one another. They do or do not make eye contact. It's rather like a dance, in which the steps reveal far more than the words spoken." Inspector Morton looked at her with the faint bewilderment of a man confronted with observations that exceeded his capacity for interpretation. "And did you notice anything else? Anything that might suggest Mr. Ashford was in a state of despair?" "I noticed," Miss Marple said slowly, "that he seemed preoccupied. But I would not have characterized his mood as despairing. Rather, I would have said he seemed concerned about something, as though some matter of importance was weighing upon his mind." "A financial matter, perhaps?" Morton suggested. "We've discovered that his business investments have been somewhat troubled recently. Perhaps the stress became too much." Miss Marple said nothing to this, though her mind was quite active. Charles Ashford might indeed have had business troubles, but they seemed unlikely to be the primary source of whatever was troubling him. The tension in the manor had been of a more intimate nature, something to do with family, with secrets, with relationships strained nearly to breaking point. "Thank you, Miss Marple," Inspector Morton said, rising to his feet. "You've been very helpful. It appears, from all accounts, that this was simply a tragic case of a man overwhelmed by his circumstances." After he departed, Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair, watching the winter darkness gather outside her window. In the distance, she could see the lights of Ashford Manor, now dimmed and shuttered. The white candle in the window had been extinguished. But in Miss Marple's mind, a far more complex picture was beginning to take shape, one in which Charles Ashford's death was not the conclusion of a story, but merely the opening chapter of something far more intricate and far more terrible. The funeral of Charles Ashford took place on the last day of the year, a deliberate choice by Patricia that allowed the Christmas holiday to pass without the added weight of immediate mourning. The service was held at St. Mary's Church, the same stone structure where generations of Little Brackstone residents had been christened, married, and buried. The congregation was large, far larger than Miss Marple would have expected for a man who had lived in the village for only 7 years. People came out of respect, out of curiosity, and out of that complicated social obligation that attends the death of the wealthy and prominent. Miss Marple sat in her customary pew, third from the front on the left side, and observed the proceedings with her characteristic quiet attention. Patricia Ashford sat in the front row, dressed in black with a veil that concealed her face. She held herself with perfect posture, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Whether this composure reflected genuine grief or simply the training of a woman accustomed to public display, Miss Marple could not yet determine. Beside Patricia sat Richard Ashford, his expression unreadable, his jaw tight. On Patricia's other side sat a woman Miss Marple did not recognize, a woman of perhaps 60 with features that bore a distant resemblance to Patricia's own. The vicar delivered a eulogy that was respectful but notably vague, containing no specific anecdotes or personal tributes to Charles's character. This was, Miss Marple reflected, precisely what one would expect when the deceased had been in the village less than a decade and had made relatively few genuine friends. People were prepared to mourn his passing out of social convention, but few had genuinely known him well enough to offer authentic remembrance. After the service, there was a gathering at the manor, a small reception attended by perhaps 30 people. Miss Marple attended, as did most of the village's social hierarchy. She moved through the rooms with her characteristic, unobtrusive grace, accepting tea and small sandwiches, offering condolences in carefully modulated tones, and, most importantly, listening to the conversations that flowed around her. It was in the library that she encountered the unknown woman who had introduced herself as Margaret Thornton, Patricia's sister, visiting from Sussex. They stood together for a moment, ostensibly examining the shelves of books, though neither was actually reading. "Terrible business," Margaret said quietly. "Patricia is devastated, though she's managing remarkably well. She always was good at managing difficult situations." "That is admirable," Miss Marple replied, "though I confess I was surprised by the news. I saw Mr. Ashford just the evening before at the Christmas gathering, and while he seemed preoccupied, I would not have anticipated such a tragic outcome." Margaret turned to look at her with sudden intensity. "You were at the party? Then perhaps you noticed something. The police have been rather unclear about the exact circumstances, and Patricia has been beside herself trying to understand how she could have missed the signs of his despair." Miss Marple considered this carefully. "I noticed that there seemed to be some tension between family members. Mr. Ashford's son's arrival was clearly unexpected and somewhat disruptive, but this is not uncommon when estranged relatives encounter one another." "Richard?" Margaret said, her voice dropping further. "Yes, that was quite a shock. He's been away for years, and Charles had spoken of him very little. I'm not entirely certain what the rift was about, but it was clearly profound." She paused, as though weighing whether to continue. "There were also business difficulties, I believe, though Patricia was somewhat reluctant to discuss them." Before Miss Marple could respond, Richard himself appeared in the doorway, seemingly looking for someone. His eyes fixed on Margaret, and he approached with the polite but distant courtesy of a man greeting an acquaintance rather than a family member. "Miss Thornton," he said, "I hope you're managing all right. It must be difficult, being away from your own home at such a time." "I'll stay as long as Patricia needs me," Margaret replied, her tone suggesting that this was a well-established pattern between them. "Richard, I've been meaning to ask, will you be staying in the village for a time? I imagine there will be matters to settle regarding your father's estate." Richard's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "That will depend on how quickly certain affairs can be concluded. I have business of my own that requires my attention." He excused himself shortly after, leaving Miss Marple with the distinct impression that whatever business Richard claimed to have elsewhere in the world was considerably less pressing than whatever business required his immediate attention in Little Brackstone. Over the following week, as the new year settled into the village, Miss Marple found herself acquiring information in the way she always did, through the small confidences of people who believed her too old and too disengaged to pose any threat. Mrs. Cole at the shop mentioned, in passing, that Patricia had been seen visiting the solicitor's office with unusual frequency. The vicar's wife, Eleanor Thornbury, mentioned during a garden club meeting that Richard had been observed examining his father's private papers in the manor library. And Dr. Thornbury himself, encountering Miss Marple at the market, casually remarked that he had been called to the manor twice since the funeral. Once to see Patricia, who was experiencing what he tactfully called nervous exhaustion, and once to see the mysterious gentleman who had been identified as Charles's business associate, a man named Victor Hartley, who had apparently been staying at the manor. Victor Hartley. The name struck a chord in Miss Marple's memory. It was the surname of Elizabeth Hartley, the solicitor's daughter, the young woman whom James Whitmore had watched so intently at the Christmas gathering. It was also, she realized with sudden clarity, a name she had heard before in the manor hallway, in the argument between Patricia and the man whose face she had not seen. On the 8th of January, Nearly 2 weeks after Charles's death, Miss Marple received a visitor. It was not unexpected. She had in fact been half anticipating such a call. Patricia Ashford arrived in the late afternoon, ostensibly to thank Miss Marple for her attendance at the funeral and her thoughtful note of condolence. But in reality, Miss Marple suspected, to take the measure of what the old woman knew or had observed. They sat in Miss Marple's small sitting room, with tea between them, and Patricia's composure began, almost imperceptibly, to crack. "You were watching," Patricia said finally, abandoning the pretense of social pleasantry. "At the gathering, before he died. You were watching us all, weren't you? You see things." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "I'm an old woman," she said gently. "I see what age and time have taught me to see, but I see people, Mrs. Ashford, not circumstances. And what I see in you is not the face of a woman at peace with recent events." Patricia's hands began to tremble. "He was going to ruin us," she whispered. "He was going to expose things that should have remained hidden. I tried to reason with him. I tried to make him understand that some secrets exist for very good reasons, but he refused to listen." And in that moment, Miss Marple understood that the investigation into Charles Ashford's death had entered a new and far more complicated phase, one in which the distinction between murderer and victim, between guilt and innocence, would prove far more murky and ambiguous than Inspector Morton's preliminary conclusions had suggested. Miss Marple did not ask Patricia to elaborate. Instead, she rose from her chair with the careful deliberation of age and moved toward the window, where the winter afternoon was already darkening into evening. Behind her, she could hear Patricia's breathing becoming more rapid, more labored, as though confession was a physical exertion that demanded all her strength. "I didn't kill him," Patricia said, the words tumbling out in a rush that suggested she had been holding them back for far too long. "You must believe that. Whatever you think, whatever you suspect, I did not pull that trigger. But I understand why the police believe it was suicide. I understand why everyone has accepted that explanation so readily. Because the alternative, the truth of what was happening at Ashford Manor, would be far more destructive to this village than any murder could ever be." Miss Marple turned back from the window to face her visitor. Patricia's composure had completely dissolved. She sat with her hands pressed to her face, her shoulders shaking with what might have been tears, or might have been laughter, or might have been something far more complicated than either. Her carefully maintained appearance, the elegant dress, the perfect hair, the composed expression, had fallen away entirely, revealing something raw and desperate beneath. "Tell me," Miss Marple said simply, resuming her seat. "Not as a confession to be reported to the police, but as a story that I, as an old woman who has lived through many human dramas, should understand." Patricia lowered her hands and looked at Miss Marple with an expression of such profound weariness that Miss Marple felt a sudden surge of genuine compassion. This was a woman, she realized, who had been carrying an enormous burden alone, and the burden had only grown heavier with Charles's death. "Victor Hartley came to the manor 3 months ago," Patricia began, her voice hollow. "He was Charles's business partner, or so I thought initially. They had done business together years ago, before Charles retired. They had what they called a dormant partnership agreement, which apparently meant that Victor could require Charles' participation in business ventures under certain circumstances. Charles was furious when Victor appeared with documentation proving that one of their old investments had become extremely valuable, and that Charles's investment had tripled. That would seem a cause for celebration," Miss Marple observed mildly. "It would have been," Patricia continued, "except that the investment was in property in Argentina, property that had been seized by the government during the conflict there, property that had, according to Victor's documentation, been obtained through methods that were deeply unethical. Charles wanted nothing to do with it. He wanted to liquidate his interest immediately and donate the proceeds to charity. He wanted to be rid of the entire affair." Miss Marple processed this information carefully. And Mr. Hartley objected to this course of action? Violently, Patricia confirmed. Victor stood to lose an enormous amount of money if Charles forced a dissolution of the partnership. He had already spent the anticipated proceeds. He had debts, Miss Marple, significant debts, and he was willing to do almost anything to prevent Charles from walking away. "Is Mr. Hartley still at the manor?" Miss Marple asked, though she had already gathered from Dr. Thornbury's casual remark that he was. "He is," Patricia said. "He claims he is managing Charles's affairs, settling the partnership documentation. In reality, he is here because he has nowhere else to go. He has leveraged every asset he possesses. He is, quite literally, a man with nothing to lose." The implications of this statement hung in the air between them. A man with nothing to lose was perhaps the most dangerous sort of man, not because he was naturally violent or evil, but because desperation could push any person toward actions they would never otherwise contemplate. "What about Richard?" Miss Marple asked. "Your stepson's return to the village. Was that coincidental timing?" Patricia shook her head. Richard came home because he had learned about the Argentine investment through a contact in London. He believed, correctly as it turned out, that Charles was in some sort of difficulty, and he came to offer assistance. But he arrived to find Victor already ensconced in the manor, already attempting to manipulate Charles through a combination of financial intimidation and emotional leverage. Richard and Charles argued about what should be done. Charles wanted to expose Victor, to pursue legal action if necessary. Richard wanted to handle it quietly, to protect the family name. "And you?" Miss Marple asked gently. "What did you want?" Patricia's face contorted. "I wanted it all to go away. I wanted to continue my life as it was, comfortable, respected, safe. I knew about the Argentina investment because Charles had told me. I knew it was legally obtained, whatever ethical questions surrounded it. I knew that if this became public, if the newspapers got hold of the story, it would destroy Charles' reputation, damage the family, and cause enormous suffering to people I cared about. I tried to convince Charles to simply pay Victor off, to make some sort of financial arrangement that would satisfy him and allow everyone to move forward." "But Charles refused," Miss Marple said, understanding the contours of the tragedy now. "Charles was an honorable man in his own way," Patricia whispered. "Stubborn, often cruel, frequently unreasonable, but honorable in the way that matters most. He would not compromise with Victor. He would not betray his principles for money or for reputation. So he resolved to expose the entire affair, to force a reckoning, regardless of the consequences to himself or anyone else." Miss Marple sat with this information for a long moment. The picture was becoming clearer, though there were still significant shadows in the landscape. "And Richard's whereabouts on the night of the death?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "The police would have questioned him about this." Patricia's eyes filled with tears. "Richard was with me. We were together in my bedroom attempting to determine how to manage the situation. We were there all night. But I cannot tell the police this, Miss Marple. Do you understand? I cannot claim that my stepson and I were together in secret without implying something far worse than financial scandal. Richard's reputation would be destroyed. My reputation would be destroyed. And the truth about the Argentina investment would come out anyway." Miss Marple understood perfectly. Patricia had chosen to allow the police to accept Charles's death as suicide rather than risk the revelation of what would be perceived as an illicit relationship between herself and her stepson, a perception that would follow Richard and Patricia for the rest of their lives, regardless of whether it was based in fact. But as Miss Marple listened to Patricia's desperate explanation, one crucial question remained unanswered in her mind. If neither Patricia nor Richard had killed Charles, and if the police were content to call it suicide, then who, precisely, had fired the revolver that killed Charles Ashford? And more importantly, why was that person still walking free in Little Brackstone, undetected and unknown? Miss Marple did not express shock, though the confession was significant. Instead, she settled more deeply into her chair and folded her hands in her lap, her expression one of patient attention. She had learned that people who volunteered such admissions often required nothing more than an attentive listener to unburden themselves entirely. "Tell me," she said simply. William Hartley moved to his desk and sat heavily, as though the weight of his knowledge had suddenly become too much to bear while standing. He removed his spectacles and pressed his fingers to his eyes for a moment before continuing. "Victor left Little Brackstone 30 years ago," he began. "He was always the more ambitious of us, always chasing schemes that promised vast returns and inevitable disappointment. Our parents despaired of him. When he came to me 6 months ago, claiming to have an opportunity involving a legitimate business partnership with a wealthy London investor, I was skeptical. But he seemed reformed, seemed genuinely committed to rebuilding his life. He asked me to help him establish himself respectably in the village. He said he wanted to reconnect with family, to prove he had changed." "And you believed him?" Miss Marple said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "I wanted to believe him," Hartley corrected, his voice hollow. "He is my brother, Miss Marple. One does not easily abandon family, no matter how much disappointment they have caused." So when he explained that his business partner was Charles Ashford, and that there was a significant dispute regarding their investment portfolio, I offered to assist with the legal documentation. I assumed it was a straightforward business matter. "But it was not straightforward," Miss Marple observed. "No," Hartley agreed. "As I became more involved in the details, I realized that the investment in question was in property obtained under questionable circumstances. Property seized from political prisoners. Property that Charles was, quite rightly, determined to divest himself of immediately. Victor, however, stood to lose everything, not merely the profit from the investment, but money he had borrowed against those anticipated profits. He was in genuine financial distress." Miss Marple waited, knowing there was more. 3 weeks before Christmas," Hartley continued, "Victor came to me in a state of considerable agitation. He said that Charles had become unreasonable, that he was determined to expose the investment and destroy Victor's reputation in the process. Victor asked me if there was any legal mechanism by which he could prevent Charles from liquidating the partnership. I told him there was not, that Charles had every right to terminate the arrangement. Victor became angry. He said things I do not wish to repeat. And then he asked me—" Hartley paused, his voice breaking slightly. "He asked me if I thought people could be made to understand the gravity of circumstances through fear." "Did you take that as a threat?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "I should have," Hartley said bitterly. "I should have recognized the implication immediately and reported it to the police. Instead, I told myself that Victor was simply emotional, that he was using hyperbole to express his distress. I told myself that my brother, whatever his faults, was not capable of genuine violence. I was a coward, Miss Marple. I chose not to see what was plainly before me." "And the evening of Christmas Eve?" Miss Marple prompted. "Victor did not attend the gathering," Hartley said. "He claimed to have a migraine headache and remained at the manor. The next morning, when Charles was discovered dead, Victor expressed shock and sorrow. He wept, Miss Marple. He seemed genuinely devastated. And I allowed myself to believe that perhaps Charles's death was indeed suicide, as the police concluded. I allowed myself to believe that my own negligence had not directly contributed to a man's death." "But you no longer believe this," Miss Marple said. 2 days ago," Hartley replied, "I discovered that Victor has been attempting to liquidate assets in preparation for leaving the country. He has obtained false documentation and is planning to depart within the week. When I confronted him about his intentions, he became violent. He said things that convinced me utterly that he had killed Charles. Not out of premeditation, but out of a desperate impulse to prevent Charles from destroying him entirely." Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the window, looking out at the dark village street below. The pieces of the puzzle were aligning now, though certain elements still required clarification. "You have not reported this to the police," she observed. I have not, Hartley confirmed. And therein lies my moral dilemma, Miss Marple. If I report my brother's actions, I will be confirming my own negligence in failing to report his threats. I will be destroying the reputation of my family. My daughter Elizabeth will be tainted by association, and I will be admitting that I allowed my desire to believe in my brother's reformation to override my duty to society. Yet if I remain silent, I'm enabling a murderer to escape justice. Miss Marple turned back to face him. Has Victor explicitly confessed to killing Charles Ashford? Not in words, Hartley said, but his preparations to flee, his evasiveness, his emotional instability, all of it points to guilt. Circumstantial evidence, Miss Marple observed. Suggestive, certainly, but not conclusive. Tell me, Mr. Hartley, do you have absolute certainty that your brother killed Charles Ashford, or do you have only a reasonable suspicion based on incomplete information? Hartley opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, recognition dawning in his eyes. I have suspicion, he admitted, but not certainty, not actual proof. Then, Miss Marple said, perhaps before we involve the police and destroy multiple lives on the basis of suspicion, we should first ascertain the truth with greater precision. I propose that you allow me to assist you in determining what actually occurred at Ashford Manor on the night of Charles's death. And I propose that we conduct this investigation with considerably more care than Inspector Morton has thus far demonstrated. Hartley looked at her with something between hope and desperation. And how would you propose we do that? Miss Marple smiled, a small, knowing smile that suggested she had already begun to formulate a plan. By observing, she said, what people do when they believe no one is watching. The following morning, Miss Marple arrived at Ashford Manor at precisely 10 o'clock, having arranged her visit through Patricia with the pretext of paying a sympathy call. Patricia, who had been expecting her, received her in the drawing-room with considerably more composure than she had displayed during her tearful confession 3 days prior. The woman had clearly benefited from the intervening time, having regained her equilibrium sufficiently to present a facade of grieving widow to the outside world. Miss Marple, Patricia said, gesturing toward a chair positioned near the window, how kind of you to call. I confess the days have been rather difficult since the funeral. The house feels so empty now. Miss Marple settled into the offered chair and accepted the tea Patricia had prepared. Through the window, she could observe the winter garden, where frost still clung to the lawn despite the advancing daylight. I imagine it must be a profound adjustment, she said gently. Losing a spouse, particularly under such tragic circumstances, leaves a considerable void. It does, Patricia replied, though her tone suggested she was performing the role of grieving widow rather than experiencing genuine devastation. Though I confess that Charles and I had not been entirely harmonious in recent months. I suspect that will make my adjustment somewhat less traumatic than it might otherwise be. This was spoken with a directness that surprised Miss Marple, though she concealed her reaction. Patricia, it seemed, had decided that honesty with Miss Marple served her purposes better than continued pretense. Is Mr. Hartley still residing at the manor? Miss Marple inquired, sipping her tea. He is, Patricia confirmed. Though his presence has become increasingly awkward, there are estate matters that require settlement, but I have the distinct impression that he is simply avoiding his creditors and his responsibilities elsewhere. He spends most of his time in Charles's study, which seems rather ghoulish to me, though I suppose he believes he has some right to inventory Charles's business papers. And your stepson? Does Richard remain in residence as well? Patricia's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Richard has taken rooms in the village, at Mrs. Hendrick's boarding house. He visits regularly, but I think he felt it inappropriate to remain under the same roof as myself given the circumstances and the village gossip. He's a thoughtful man in his way, though he and Charles never quite resolved their differences. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. I wonder if I might impose upon your hospitality to view the study, she said. I find that I am rather morbidly curious about the room where such a tragedy occurred. It is perhaps an unpleasant request, but I have found that confronting difficult places often helps one process difficult emotions. Patricia hesitated for only a moment before rising. Of course. It is rather morbid, but I understand the impulse. The study is largely as Charles left it, though the police have removed various items for their investigation. The study was a handsome room on the manor's ground floor with dark paneling and shelves lined with leather-bound volumes that appeared largely unread. The desk was substantial, made of mahogany, positioned to face the door. Behind it, the wall was decorated with a painting of hunting dogs and a small mirror. The chair where Charles had allegedly shot himself was positioned at an angle, and the desk drawer where the revolver had allegedly been kept was slightly ajar. Miss Marple moved into the room slowly, her eyes taking in every detail. She observed the position of the furniture, the placement of the lamp on the desk, the arrangement of papers. She noted the absence of any obvious blood stains. The police would have cleaned those, but she paid particular attention to the wall behind the chair where Charles had allegedly been seated when he fired the fatal shot. "The revolver was found here?" she asked, pointing to the floor beside the desk. "Yes," Patricia confirmed. "On the carpet, just there. The police believed Charles must have dropped it immediately after firing, and that he then collapsed in the chair." Miss Marple moved to stand behind the desk chair, positioning herself where Charles would have been seated. From this vantage point, she observed the room's layout with fresh perspective. Her eyes moved from the mirror on the wall, where, theoretically, Charles might have seen his own reflection, to the door, to the windows that overlooked the garden. Then she turned her attention to the ceiling, noting the placement of the light fixture and the faint discoloration on the plaster near one corner where, perhaps, water damage had once occurred. "Has anyone cleaned this room since the death?" she asked. "The servants performed a basic cleaning," Patricia replied, "though I instructed them not to move anything significant. The police indicated they might need to conduct further examination." Miss Marple knelt with considerable effort. Her knees no longer cooperated as readily as they once had, and examined the carpet beneath the desk with meticulous attention. She noted the pattern of the pile, the slight wear in certain areas, and the absence of what one might expect to find if a man had been sitting in this chair when a revolver discharged. Gunshot residue, the police would have called it. Blood spatter, evidence of violence. "Miss Marple," Patricia said quietly, "what exactly are you looking for?" Miss Marple rose slowly, accepting Patricia's assistance without pride. "I am looking," she said, "for inconsistencies between the story the police have accepted and the physical reality of this room, and I am finding several." She moved to the window and observed the garden beyond. From this position, anyone standing in the study would have a clear view of the side path that led toward the servants' entrance. She noted that the path, while covered with frost, bore no visible footprints or signs of recent disturbance. "One more question," Miss Marple said, turning back to Patricia. "On the night of Charles's death, who had access to this study? Who knew where the revolver was kept?" Patricia's face had gone quite pale. "Charles kept the drawer locked. The key was in his possession always, or so I believed. And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "if someone wished to stage his suicide, they would need access to that key. They would need to know it existed and know where it was kept. That represents a considerable degree of familiarity with Charles's private arrangements." Patricia sank into the nearest chair. "You think someone other than my brother murdered Charles?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that we have all been accepting a narrative that is far too convenient, far too tidy. And I think that before we allow an innocent person to take the blame, or before we allow the guilty person to escape, we must first determine precisely what occurred in this room on Christmas morning." Miss Marple left Ashford Manor at 11:30, her mind engaged in the peculiar intensity of focus that characterized her investigative process. She had requested, and Patricia had granted, permission to return the following day for a more thorough examination of the study, a request that Patricia had accepted with visible relief, as though the prospect of someone else bearing the burden of understanding what had occurred was profoundly comforting. The morning was cold but clear, the sun casting sharp shadows across the village street as Miss Marple made her way toward Mrs. Hendrick's boarding house, a substantial Victorian structure on the high street that had been converted into residential rooms for transient guests. It was here that Richard Ashford had taken lodging, and Miss Marple had decided that a conversation with Charles's estranged son was overdue. Mrs. Hendrick herself answered the door, a woman of perhaps 65 with the bustling manner of someone who considered her boarding house to be her personal domain and its residents to be her responsibility. She greeted Miss Marple with the particular warmth reserved for village fixtures of long standing. "Miss Marple, what a lovely surprise! Are you well? Can I offer you tea?" "I am well enough, thank you," Miss Marple replied. "I have come hoping to speak with Mr. Richard Ashford if he is in residence." Mrs. Hendrick's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "He is in his room, though I'm not certain he's receiving visitors. He's been quite withdrawn since his father's death. Keeps to himself mostly, goes out for walks, returns looking troubled. The poor man seems quite devastated by it all." "Nevertheless," Miss Marple said gently, "I wonder if you might convey to him that Miss Marple from the village would appreciate a few moments of his time." Richard emerged 15 minutes later, descending the stairs with the reluctant manner of a man complying with an obligation rather than welcoming an opportunity for conversation. He was dressed in dark clothing, as one might expect of a man in mourning, and his expression carried the weight of genuine distress. Yet Miss Marple, observing him carefully, noted something else beneath the surface. A watchfulness, a calculation, the subtle tension of someone monitoring his own performance. "Miss Marple," he said, extending his hand. "Mrs. Hendrick mentioned you wished to speak with me. I confess I'm somewhat at a loss as to why you would seek me out." "Shall we sit?" Miss Marple suggested, indicating the small parlor off the entrance hall where Mrs. Hendrick had arranged seating. Once they were settled, with the door closed for privacy, Miss Marple spoke with uncharacteristic directness. "I am attempting to understand the circumstances of your father's death. The police have concluded it was suicide, but I have reason to believe that conclusion may be premature." Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I was not present at the manor when he died. Patricia and I have both confirmed that we were together elsewhere in the house." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "So I understand. Yet I wonder if you might help me understand the nature of the conflict between yourself and your father, the dispute that brought you home after a decade's absence." Richard rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out at the frost-laden street. "My father and I had not spoken in 10 years, he said quietly. When I learned that he was in financial difficulty due to an unethical investment he wished to distance himself from, I felt obligated to return and offer assistance. I thought perhaps we might reconcile, might repair some of the damage caused by years of estrangement." "And what caused that estrangement?" Miss Marple asked. Richard turned to face her, and in his eyes Miss Marple saw genuine pain, genuine loss. "My mother," he said. "My father left her when I was 16 years old, abandoned her for a woman 20 years younger. He justified it as a matter of personal happiness, as though his own contentment superseded his obligations to the woman who had spent her life supporting his ambitions. My mother never recovered from the betrayal. She died 5 years ago, still waiting for him to acknowledge the harm he had caused. And that was why you severed contact." "I could not forgive him," Richard confirmed. "I could not accept his justifications or pretend that his actions had been anything other than a profound betrayal of the woman who loved him. When I came home for Christmas, I hoped perhaps that some time and distance might have changed my perspective. Instead, I found him engaged in the same pattern of behavior, pursuing his own interests, his own comfort, regardless of the consequences to those around him. The Argentina investment was merely another manifestation of his fundamental selfishness. Miss Marple absorbed this information carefully. Richard's account was coherent, emotionally resonant, and entirely consistent with what she had learned from other sources. Yet she remained unconvinced of its complete truthfulness. "Your father intended to expose the investment scheme," she said. "This would have resulted in considerable financial loss to Mr. Hartley and potentially to others involved. Did you attempt to dissuade him from this course?" Richard returned to his seat. "Extensively," he admitted. "I argued that exposure would damage our family's reputation, that it would create legal complications, that there might be other means of resolution. My father refused to listen. He was determined to take what he perceived as the moral high ground, regardless of the consequences." "And how did you feel about that determination?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I was frustrated," Richard replied. "Angry, perhaps. But I did not kill him, Miss Marple. If you are implying that I did, I categorically deny it. Yes, I was with Patricia that evening. Yes, that creates a complication regarding village opinion. But I will not lie about my movements in order to protect my reputation at the expense of justice." Miss Marple studied his face for a long moment. He met her gaze steadily, without the flickering evasiveness that typically indicated deception. Yet Miss Marple had learned that some people were capable of extraordinary composure, of maintaining false facades with such consistency that truth became difficult to discern. "I am not accusing you of anything," Miss Marple said finally. "I am attempting to understand what occurred, and I believe that understanding requires examining not only what people have done, but also what they have had opportunity to do and what they had motivation to do." "You had opportunity. You were in the manor that evening. You had motivation. Your father's actions threatened the family's reputation and your own peace of mind. The question is whether you acted on that opportunity and motivation." Richard's composure cracked slightly. "I did not," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I swear to you, Miss Marple, I did not kill my father. Whatever else you believe, whatever else you investigate, you must believe that." As Miss Marple rose to depart, she recognized the ring of genuine truth in his denial. But truth, she'd learned, was often complex and multifaceted. Richard might not have pulled the trigger, but that did not mean he was entirely innocent of involvement in Charles Ashford's death. The afternoon found Miss Marple in her cottage, seated at her writing desk with her leather-bound notebook open before her. She had begun a new entry, dated January 10th, in which she was attempting to organize the timeline of events surrounding Charles Ashford's death with meticulous precision. The exercise had become necessary because certain inconsistencies had begun to emerge. Small discrepancies in the accounts she had been given, gaps in the narrative that did not quite align with the physical evidence she had observed in the study. The knock at her door came at 3 o'clock, delivered with sufficient force to suggest that the visitor was either anxious or angry, or both. Miss Marple set down her pen and rose to answer, discovering on her doorstep a young woman she recognized as Elizabeth Hartley, the solicitor's daughter. Elizabeth was pale beneath her careful makeup, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her expression turbulent with barely suppressed emotion. "Miss Marple," Elizabeth said without preamble, "I need to speak with you about my father, about what he may have told you regarding his brother and Charles Ashford's death." Miss Marple stepped aside to admit her, gesturing toward the sitting room. Elizabeth entered with the agitation of someone who had been wrestling with a decision and had finally reached the point of commitment. Once seated, she began speaking with the urgency of confession. "My father came to me yesterday evening," Elizabeth said. "He told me that he had spoken with you, that he had expressed his fears regarding my Uncle Victor. He was greatly distressed, Miss Marple. He seemed to believe that he had somehow enabled a murder through his negligence." "Your father is a conscientious man," Miss Marple observed. "Such distress would be entirely consistent with his character." "He is," Elizabeth confirmed, "but he is also burdened by a guilt that I do not believe he deserves." Miss Marple, I must tell you something that my father does not know. Something that will clarify the circumstances surrounding Uncle Victor and Charles Ashford's death." Miss Marple waited, her expression encouraging but non-committal. Elizabeth took a breath before continuing. "James Whitmore and I have been close for some months now. Very close. We have been discreet about it, as one must be in a village where such things are subject to gossip, but we have developed a considerable attachment to one another. Last December, before Christmas, James came to me in great distress. He told me that he had been approached by my Uncle Victor." "Approached?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "Victor told James that he was in financial difficulty," Elizabeth explained. "That he faced ruin if Charles Ashford liquidated the investment partnership. Victor claimed he had information that might be useful to James. Information regarding certain financial irregularities in James's inherited estate. Victor suggested that if James could persuade Charles Ashford to reconsider his decision to expose the investment, Victor would remain silent about these irregularities. This revelation hung in the air between them. Miss Marple understood immediately the implications. Victor had attempted blackmail, using threats of exposure as leverage to gain James's cooperation. "What did James do?" Miss Marple asked. "He refused," Elizabeth said. "He told me that he would not be party to such a scheme, that honor mattered more than financial security. He also told me that he intended to inform Charles of the blackmail attempt, believing that Charles should be aware of the full extent of Victor's desperation." "And did he do so?" "That is the complication," Elizabeth said, her voice becoming quieter. "James came to the Christmas Eve gathering with the intention of speaking with Charles privately. But when he arrived at the manor, he discovered that the situation had become more complicated. Richard Ashford had already confronted Charles regarding the investment. The family was in turmoil. James decided that introducing information about the blackmail attempt would only add to the chaos, and he resolved to speak with Charles after the gathering had concluded. But he did not have that opportunity," Miss Marple said, understanding the tragic trajectory of events. "He did not," Elizabeth confirmed. "Charles was dead before James could speak with him. And when the police concluded it was suicide, James believed that speaking of the blackmail attempt would serve no purpose except to implicate Uncle Victor in a scheme that, while morally reprehensible, had not directly resulted in Charles's death." Miss Marple rose and moved to her window, observing the darkening afternoon with careful attention. The pieces were shifting again, the pattern reforming. Victor had attempted blackmail. James had refused cooperation. Charles had been determined to expose the investment. But somewhere in this tangle of motivations and actions, someone had decided that Charles's death was preferable to Charles's disclosure. "Miss Hartley," Miss Marple said, turning back to face the young woman, "did James indicate to you whether he spoke with your uncle after learning of the blackmail attempt?" Elizabeth hesitated. "He said he confronted Uncle Victor that evening after the gathering had ended. He told him that he would not be party to any scheme and that Victor should prepare himself for the consequences of his actions." "Did James indicate what Victor's reaction to this was?" "He said Uncle Victor became extremely agitated, that he seemed to lose control of himself entirely. James feared for a moment that Victor might become violent, but eventually Victor simply left the room, and James did not see him again that evening." Miss Marple returned to her seat, her mind working through the implications of this new information. Victor, rejected and desperate. Victor, informed that his blackmail scheme had failed, and that exposure was inevitable. Victor, aware that Charles intended to liquidate the partnership and destroy him financially. The question was no longer whether Victor had motivation to kill Charles. The question was whether Victor had been sufficiently desperate, sufficiently unbalanced by the cascading failures of his schemes, to act on that motivation. "Where is your uncle now?" Miss Marple asked. "He departed the manor this morning," Elizabeth said. "Father received a telegram indicating that he had taken the train to London. He did not leave any forwarding address." This revelation struck Miss Marple with the force of confirmation. A guilty man fleeing. A man who had realized that his crimes were being questioned, that investigation was proceeding, and that his presence in the village had become untenable. Yet the question remained, was Victor fleeing because he had killed Charles, or was he fleeing because he feared being blamed for a crime he had not committed? "Thank you for coming to me," Miss Marple said quietly. "You have clarified several important matters. I wonder if you might do one more thing for me. Might you provide me with James Whitmore's address? I believe I should speak with him as well." Elizabeth provided the information, and after she departed, Miss Marple sat in her darkening cottage, her hands folded in her lap, contemplating the murder that was becoming increasingly complex with each revelation. The victim was still dead. The revolver was still his own. The location was still his study. But the identity of the killer remained frustratingly elusive, obscured by layers of deception, desperation, and the fundamental human capacity for self-preservation that could motivate virtually anyone to extraordinary acts. James Whitmore's residence was a handsome manor house situated on the eastern edge of the village, inherited along with considerable acreage when his uncle had passed away 3 years prior. The estate was well maintained, but carried an air of temporary occupation, as though James himself had not yet fully settled into the role of country gentleman that his inheritance demanded. Miss Marple arrived at 4 o'clock the following afternoon, having sent a note in advance requesting an appointment, which James had granted with apparent eagerness. He received her in a library lined with first editions and leather-bound volumes that suggested either genuine erudition or a decorator's careful selection. James himself was a man of perhaps 30 years, with the sort of delicate features that suggested both sensitivity and a certain weakness of character. His manner toward Miss Marple was deferential, almost anxious, as though he feared judgment from the village's most perceptive observer. "Miss Marple," he said, offering her a chair positioned near the library's fireplace. "Elizabeth indicated that you wished to speak with me regarding matters pertaining to Charles Ashford's death. I confess I have been expecting such a conversation, though I hoped it might not become necessary." "Mr. Whitmore," Miss Marple began, settling into her chair with the deliberate care of age, "I have come to understand that you possessed information regarding Charles's death that you have not shared with the police. This information, while perhaps not directly implicating you in the crime, might nevertheless be relevant to determining what actually occurred." James moved to stand near the fireplace, his hands clasped before him in a gesture that suggested emotional restraint. "I was afraid," he said simply. "When Charles was found dead, and the police concluded it was suicide, I hoped that my silence would spare the village unnecessary turmoil, the truth about Victor's blackmail scheme, the desperation that drove him to such actions, the family discord that had been escalating. It all seemed likely to create far more harm than good if revealed." "And yet," Miss Marple observed gently, "you have now chosen to reveal it. What changed your mind?" "Elizabeth convinced me that withholding information from an investigation, however well-intentioned, was itself a form of dishonesty," James replied. "She is a remarkable woman, Miss Marple. She possesses a clarity of moral vision that I have come to admire profoundly." "Tell me precisely what occurred on Christmas Eve evening," Miss Marple said. "From the moment you arrived at the gathering to the moment you departed." James settled into a chair across from Miss Marple and began his account with the methodical precision of someone who had already rehearsed the narrative multiple times in his own mind. He described his arrival at the manor, his conversation with Elizabeth, his subsequent confrontation with Victor Hartley in the hallway outside the drawing room. He detailed Victor's desperation, his attempts at coercion, his barely controlled rage when James refused cooperation. "He told me," James said, "that I was making a terrible mistake, that I did not understand the forces in motion, that there were consequences I had not anticipated. He said something that struck me as peculiar at the time. He said that Charles Ashford had set events in motion that could not be stopped, that he was forcing everyone involved to make choices they would later regret. "Did you interpret this as a threat?" Miss Marple asked. "I did," James confirmed. "But I believed the threat was directed at me, not at Charles. I thought Victor was warning me that refusing his demands would result in the exposure of the financial irregularities in my estate. I did not foresee—" His voice broke slightly. "I did not anticipate that Victor might resort to violence." "What did you do after this confrontation?" "I removed myself from the gathering," James said. "I went to the library, where I remained for perhaps an hour, attempting to compose myself. The gathering was winding down by that time. Most guests had departed. I heard voices in the corridor. Charles and Richard arguing, I believe, though I could not hear the specific words. Eventually the voices faded, and I assumed they had moved to a different part of the house." "Did you observe Victor Hartley at any point after your confrontation with him?" James shook his head. He seemed to have removed himself from the gathering as well. "I did not see him again that evening." Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her fingers forming a steeple as she considered this information. The timeline was becoming clearer, but a crucial gap remained. Victor had departed the gathering, but where had he gone? Had he gone to Charles's study? Had he confronted Charles directly? Had he, in a moment of desperation and rage, seized the revolver from Charles's desk and acted on the impulse to eliminate the threat that Charles represented to his survival? "Mr. Whitmore," Miss Marple said, "I must ask you a question that may seem impertinent. At any point during the evening, did you observe the study door? Did you notice whether it was open or closed? Did you see anyone entering or exiting that room?" James's expression became troubled. "There was something," he admitted slowly. "When I was in the library, I heard what sounded like a door closing firmly. The sound of a heavy door, not an ordinary interior door. The study has a rather distinctive sound when its door closes, a particular quality to the noise. At the time I did not think much of it, but in retrospect—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the implications of what he was about to say. "In retrospect, I've wondered whether that sound coincided with the moment of Charles's death." "And approximately what time did you hear this sound?" Miss Marple asked. "Perhaps 11 o'clock, James replied. "Shortly before midnight, in any case. The gathering was clearly concluding by that time. Most guests had either departed or were preparing to leave." Miss Marple rose from her chair with the slow grace that characterized her movements. She moved toward the library window, which overlooked the darkened gardens beyond. Outside, the winter evening had descended into complete darkness, and the world beyond the glass had become a mirror reflecting the interior of the room. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, without turning from the window, "I believe you are telling me the truth regarding your observations. However, I believe there is one matter you have not yet fully disclosed. I believe that after hearing the study door close, you took some action. You investigated, perhaps? You checked to determine whether Charles was safe?" There was a long silence behind her. When James finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I did go to the study," he admitted. "I found the door unlocked. I opened it slightly and looked inside. Charles was slumped in his chair and there was a revolver on the floor. I believed at that moment that he had taken his own life. And His voice broke entirely. "I did not raise an alarm. I closed the door quietly and returned to the library. I told myself that he might have simply fallen asleep, that investigation would be premature. But I knew, Miss Marple. I knew something was terribly wrong, and I did nothing." Miss Marple turned from the window to face him. "And did you observe anything else in that moment? Anything that might indicate whether Charles had been alone in the study or whether someone else had been present?" James closed his eyes, his face contorted with the effort of memory. "There was a faint scent," he said. "Something acrid, chemical. Gunpowder, perhaps, though I did not recognize it as such at the time, and—" He opened his eyes. "And there was a figure in the corridor. I saw someone moving away from the study as I approached it. I could not see their face clearly in the darkness, but I had the impression of someone moving with purpose, with urgency. Could you describe this figure? Miss Marple asked intently. Their height, their build, their clothing? They were wearing dark clothing, James said. That much I could see. And they moved with the gait of someone accustomed to authority, to command. Beyond that, I could not determine. He stopped, realization dawning in his eyes. You know who it was, he said, understanding crystallizing in his voice. You already know who killed Charles Ashford. Miss Marple smiled, a small, sad smile. I have an hypothesis, she said quietly. But hypothesis is not certainty, and certainty is what justice requires. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage and completed her notes with careful precision. The evidence, when arranged chronologically and logically, presented a narrative that was internally consistent and psychologically coherent. Yet she remained aware that certainty in matters of crime and justice required more than logical deduction. It required confession, admission, the voluntary or involuntary revelation of guilt by the perpetrator themselves. She spent the night in her customary manner, reading by the fire, reflecting on human nature and its capacity for both extraordinary compassion and devastating cruelty. By morning, she had formulated a plan that would either confirm her hypothesis or force her to reconsider entirely the conclusion she had reached. The invitation she sent to Ashford Manor was framed as an invitation to tea, couched in the language of social convention. She requested the presence of Patricia Ashford, Richard Ashford, and Victor Hartley, though she expected that Victor had already fled the village. She also requested that William Hartley attend, should his brother have returned. The invitations were delivered by hand through the village post, and responses began arriving by mid-afternoon. Patricia confirmed her attendance. Richard confirmed his attendance. William Hartley sent regrets, indicating that his brother had not returned, and a telegram arrived from London, bearing Victor's response. Unable to attend. Business matters require my immediate attention elsewhere. Safe travels to all. At 3 o'clock on the afternoon of January 12th, Miss Marple received her visitors in her cottage's sitting room. Patricia arrived first, dressed in black, but with touches of color that suggested she was beginning to emerge from the depths of mourning. Richard arrived shortly after, his expression wary, his posture defensive. And then, to Miss Marple's surprise, Margaret Thornton entered, Patricia's sister, who had ostensibly returned to Sussex but had apparently remained in the village. I thought it best that Margaret be present, Patricia said by way of explanation. As my sister and my closest confidant, she deserves to know whatever truth you have uncovered. Miss Marple settled herself in her chair and regarded her visitors with an expression of profound sadness. I have spent the past 2 weeks attempting to understand what occurred at Ashford Manor on Christmas morning, she began. The police concluded that Charles Ashford took his own life, and I confess I can understand why such a conclusion seemed plausible. A wealthy man under considerable stress, facing financial exposure and family discord, discovered dead in his study with his own revolver. The narrative was tidy, it was tragic, and it resolved the matter quickly. But you do not believe he killed himself, Richard said quietly. No, Miss Marple confirmed. I do not, and I believe that several of you have suspected as much, though you have chosen, for various reasons, to remain silent. But silence, while it protects the living, also prevents justice from taking its proper course. So I must now ask you to listen to what I have discovered, and to respond with honesty. She paused, collecting her thoughts with the deliberate care of someone about to reveal conclusions that would irrevocably alter multiple lives. Charles Ashford was killed by someone who knew him intimately, someone who understood his habits and his vulnerabilities, someone who had access to his private spaces and his private documents. The revolver used in the murder was his own, kept in his desk drawer. The key to that drawer was in Charles's possession at all times. or so we believed. But what if someone else also knew where that key was kept? What if someone had observed Charles's habits closely enough to anticipate his actions and his movements? Margaret Thornton shifted in her chair, her expression becoming suddenly guarded. Miss Marple noted this minute change with great interest. On Christmas Eve, Miss Marple continued, several significant events occurred. Richard returned to the manor after years of absence, bringing with him knowledge of Charles's intention to expose the Argentina investment. Victor Hartley attempted blackmail against James Whitmore, demonstrating the depth of his desperation. Charles argued with both his son and his wife regarding the proper course of action. And at approximately 11 o'clock in the evening, Charles was shot in his study, and someone departed that room with a revolver in their hand. "You cannot possibly know who that person was," Patricia said, her voice strained. "You were not present. You cannot have seen—" "I did not need to be present," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "I needed only to understand human nature and to recognize that certain actions are consistent with certain personalities. I needed to understand that whoever killed Charles had a motive, not merely financial, but deeply personal. I needed to recognize that the revolver was placed near Charles's body deliberately, staged to suggest suicide, and I needed to understand that someone in this village possessed the knowledge, the opportunity, and the emotional complexity to accomplish such an act." Margaret Thornton stood abruptly. "I cannot listen to this," she said. "I will not sit here while you make accusations." "Please," Miss Marple said, her voice carrying an unexpected note of authority. "Sit down, Miss Thornton. For Patricia's sake, if not for your own, please sit down and allow me to finish." Margaret hesitated, then resumed her seat, her hands trembling visibly. "You came to Little Brackstone to visit your sister," Miss Marple continued, addressing Margaret directly. "But your visit was not entirely social, was it? You came because Patricia had written to you in distress, confiding in you about Charles's intention to expose the Argentina investment. You came because you understood that this exposure would damage your sister's life and her security. And you came with a plan to prevent that exposure from occurring." "That is absurd," Margaret said coldly. "I am a woman of 58 years. I have no knowledge of weapons, no motive to harm anyone." "You had the greatest motive of all," Miss Marple said gently. "You love your sister. You have stood beside her through difficulties, through heartbreak, through the complications of her marriage to a man who, while wealthy and prominent, was also deeply flawed. You knew that exposure of the Argentina investment would destroy Patricia's reputation, would make her vulnerable to social ostracism, would threaten her security and her peace of mind. And you believed, however incorrectly, that preventing that exposure was worth any price, including murder." The room had gone absolutely silent. Even the fire in the fireplace seemed to murmur more quietly, as though the very house was holding its breath. "You observed Charles's habits closely," Miss Marple continued. "You noted where he kept his study key. You understood his daily routines. You recognized the moment when the gathering was winding down and the manor would be largely empty. And you chose that moment to act. You went to the study. You retrieved the revolver from Charles's desk. You confronted him about his intention to expose the investment. When he refused to reconsider, when he insisted that honor required exposure regardless of the consequences, you fired the revolver. You placed it near his body to suggest suicide, and you departed, leaving behind a crime that appeared to be a tragedy rather than a murder." Margaret's composure finally shattered. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. "He would not listen," she whispered. "He would not understand that some secrets should remain hidden for the sake of those we love. He was so determined to be righteous, to prove his honor, that he could not see the damage he would cause. I only wanted to stop him. I only wanted to protect Patricia." Richard had gone very pale. Patricia sat motionless, her expression a study in horror and heartbreak, and beneath it all, a terrible understanding of what her sister had done in the name of love. "I must inform Inspector Morton of what I have discovered," Miss Marple said quietly. "The law cannot be circumvented, regardless of the motivations that led to crime. But I wanted you to hear the truth first, from someone who understands that human beings are rarely simply good or simply evil, but rather complex creatures capable of both extraordinary compassion and devastating harm." Margaret lowered her hands from her face. Her eyes were red, her composure entirely dissolved. "Will you tell him?" she asked. "Will you tell the inspector everything?" "I will tell him what he needs to know to understand that Charles Ashford was murdered, and who murdered him," Miss Marple replied. "What happens after that is the province of law and justice, not of an old woman observing from the sidelines." By evening, Inspector Morton had been summoned to Ashford Manor. By the following morning, Margaret Thornton had been taken into custody. The subsequent trial was, for a village the size of Little Brackstone, a cause of considerable sensation. The newspapers descended, eager for a story of passion and murder, of family loyalty twisted into crime. But Miss Marple, having given her testimony and seen the law take its course, withdrew from public attention, returning to her cottage and her garden and her quiet observations of human nature. 3 months later, as spring began to return to Little Brackstone and the first flowers began to push through the warming earth, Miss Marple received a letter from Patricia Ashford. The letter was brief, written in shaking handwriting, and contained no request for forgiveness or understanding, merely a simple statement of gratitude that the truth had finally emerged, and that the family could begin, however painfully, to heal. Miss Marple kept the letter in her desk, alongside her other notes and observations. She had learned, over a lifetime of such investigations, that justice was rarely satisfying, that truth was often heartbreaking, and that the most important work of a detective was not to condemn, but to understand, to recognize that every crime emerged from a tangle of human motivation, human weakness, human love twisted into something terrible and destructive. The white candle in the window at Ashford Manor would never burn again. The manor itself would be sold within the year, passed into other hands, its secrets locked behind closed doors. But in the village of Little Brackstone, people would speak for decades of the Christmas when Charles Ashford died, and of the old woman who had quietly, methodically, relentlessly uncovered the truth. And Miss Marple, tending her garden as the seasons turned, continued her quiet work of observation, knowing that somewhere in the village another secret was growing in the darkness, another crime waiting to happen, another human being struggling with the terrible choices that life sometimes forced upon them. Such was the nature of villages, and such was the burden of those who truly saw what others preferred to overlook.